One way of estimating how many women experience corporal punishment at school would be to take a very simple statistical approach. By considering the proportion of women one has personally met who reported being caned at school, and then applying that proportion to the wider population while taking account of age, educational background, and other relevant factors, it would be possible to arrive at a rough estimate. Naturally, such a method would involve considerable uncertainty. Any estimate would need to be accompanied by a confidence interval to acknowledge the limitations of the sample. Even so, it is clear that the number of women who experienced school caning in England was far greater than a handful of isolated cases. While it would be impossible to determine an exact figure without comprehensive records, it seems reasonable to suggest that the total may have reached into the tens of thousands. Of course, knowing how many pupils were caned tells us very little about whether the punishment itself was effective. Numbers alone cannot answer questions about deterrence, discipline, or the long-term impact of corporal punishment. To understand those issues, it is necessary to examine individual experiences and attitudes. Perceptions of fairness. A recurring theme in discussions about school punishment is the question of fairness. Consider two different examples. In one case, a pupil received a caning after arriving late, despite believing that the circumstances were beyond her control. In another case, the pupil acknowledged that she had broken the rules, but questioned whether the severity of the punishment was proportionate to the offence. The first example raises a straightforward issue. If a person genuinely believes that they are being punished for something they could not prevent, resentment is almost inevitable. The nature of the punishment may be secondary to the perception that justice has not been done. This prompts an interesting question. Would boys have reacted differently under the same circumstances? How many boys would have accepted a caning, or indeed any punishment, for an event over which they had no control? It is difficult to imagine that resentment would have been absent simply because the pupil was male. The second example is more complex. Here the issue is not whether punishment was deserved, but whether the specific punishment imposed was appropriate. Some pupils might have preferred an alternative sanction such as a lengthy detention, extra work, or repetitive written exercises. Others might have found those alternatives even more objectionable than corporal punishment. This highlights the subjective nature of disciplinary measures. Different individuals respond differently to different forms of punishment, making it difficult to establish any universal hierarchy of severity. Cultural attitudes and expectations. The debate also raises broader questions about attitudes toward fairness and discipline. Unlike physical pain, which has a biological basis, concepts such as fairness are heavily influenced by culture, upbringing, and social expectations. It is therefore worth considering whether boys and girls were traditionally taught to view discipline differently. One argument is that boys were often raised with the expectation that life would be harsh and competitive, and that setbacks or perceived injustices simply had to be endured. From this perspective, punishment, fair or otherwise, might have been accepted as an unavoidable part of growing up. However, others dispute the idea that girls were necessarily taught stronger values of fairness or reciprocity. They argue that many girls were instead raised with expectations of greater protection or leniency. In some schools and households, boys quickly learned that misconduct would result in punishment, whereas girls could sometimes expect a more sympathetic response. Whether these perceptions accurately reflected reality is open to debate. What is clear is that children of both sexes developed expectations based on the environments in which they grew up. Their reactions to punishment were often shaped as much by those expectations as by the punishment itself. Interestingly, boys and girls are equally capable of protesting that something is not fair. The difference may lie less in their sensitivity to fairness and more in what each group considers fair treatment. Looking back on school discipline, conversations about school days often reveal a fascinating mixture of nostalgia, honesty, and reflection. When former pupils discuss their experiences, stories of misbehavior and the resulting punishments frequently emerge. What is striking is how often people look back and conclude that, although schools were strict, they were generally fair. A common sentiment is, they were strict, but I probably deserved it. This retrospective assessment appears to play an important role in determining whether resentment remains. When individuals believe, even years later, that a punishment was justified and proportionate, they are less likely to harbour lasting grievances. The issue of fairness often proves more significant than the punishment itself. During the period when corporal punishment was widely accepted, many pupils regarded it as simply one of several disciplinary tools available to teachers. In co-educational schools, where boys and girls were subject to the same disciplinary framework, many former pupils recall that punishments were administered according to conduct rather than gender. Whether one agrees with corporal punishment or not, it is important to recognise that it was, for much of the 20th century, an accepted feature of school discipline. Judging past attitudes requires an understanding of the social norms of the time. The personal nature of caning. An important distinction exists between corporal punishment and many other forms of discipline. Detention, for example, is often an impersonal punishment. Although a particular teacher may impose it, the teacher who supervises the detention may not be the one who originally assigned it. The punishment becomes part of a broader institutional process. Any resentment that develops is likely to be directed toward the school or the rules in general, rather than toward a single individual. Caning is fundamentally different. It is immediate, direct, and personal. The person imposing the punishment is physically present and actively administering it. If resentment develops, it is likely to be focused on that individual, rather than on the institution as a whole. This personal dimension may help explain why corporal punishment often provokes stronger emotional responses than other disciplinary measures. The experience is not merely one of being punished by a system, it is one of being punished by a specific person. For some pupils, that distinction may have made the punishment feel more meaningful and effective. For others, it may have intensified feelings of anger, humiliation, or injustice. Ultimately, discussions about school caning often return to the same central issue. Not simply whether punishment occurred, but whether those subjected to it believed it was fair. The answer to that question appears to have varied considerably from one individual to another, regardless of gender.